Racist cop smashes black man's car. Not knowing he's the new police captain, a routine traffic stop spirals into destruction. But the officer's actions will have unexpected consequences when the truth is revealed. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The bustling downtown precinct of Milton Heights housed Jamal Thompson's law office, a modest space adorned with legal certificates and civil rights memorabilia. On a busy Tuesday morning, Jamal sat across from Marcus Wilson, a 19-year-old college student who'd been wrongfully detained outside his campus library. Marcus fidgeted with his hands as he recounted the incident. "They said I matched the description, Mr. Thompson, but they held me for 3 hours without cause," Marcus explained, his voice trembling. "I missed my midterm exam." Jamal leaned forward, his dark suit crisp despite the early hour. At 35, he'd handled dozens of similar cases, but his recent appointment as police captain added a new dimension to his role. He jotted notes in his legal pad, his handwriting precise and measured. "Marcus, I need you to understand something," Jamal said, setting down his pen. "What happened to you isn't just wrong, it's illegal. And as both your attorney and a police captain, I'm going to ensure this incident is properly addressed." The meeting concluded with a clear action plan. Jamal would file a formal complaint and begin the process of seeking academic accommodation for Marcus's missed exam. As he walked his client out, Jamal checked his watch. He had a department meeting in 30 minutes. The incident with Lieutenant Mark Jenkins occurred on Maple Street, just 3 blocks from the courthouse. Jamal's black Mercedes was stopped at a red light when the police cruiser, driven by Jenkins, made an aggressive right turn, scraping against Jamal's driver's side door and shattering his window. Glass scattered across Jamal's lap as he instinctively raised his arms to protect his face. The screech of metal against metal filled the air, followed by the distinct sound of a car door slamming. Lieutenant Jenkins approached, his hand resting casually on his holster. "License and registration," Jenkins demanded, not bothering to ask if Jamal was injured. "Lieutenant Jenkins," Jamal said, keeping his voice steady. "You know who I am. I'm Captain Thompson." Jenkins's expression shifted, but not toward recognition or respect. A smirk played at the corners of his mouth as he looked down at the damage he'd caused. "Well, if it isn't our new diversity hire. Seems like you had trouble maintaining your lane, Captain." Jamal stepped out of his car, glass crunching under his shoes. "Your dashcam will show exactly what happened here, Lieutenant. I expect a full incident report on my desk by tomorrow morning." "Sure thing, Captain," Jenkins replied, emphasizing the title with obvious disdain. "I'll be sure to note how your vehicle swerved into my path." The gathering crowd of onlookers made Jamal acutely aware of the optics. Here he was, a newly appointed police captain, being treated like a common criminal by his own lieutenant. Several people had their phones out, recording the interaction. Later that afternoon, Jamal walked into the precinct, incident report forms in hand. The usual buzz of activity in the bullpen dimmed as he entered. Officers who normally greeted him with at least professional courtesy suddenly found their computer screens fascinating. As he approached the desk sergeant, laughter erupted from the break room. Through the glass partition, Jamal could see Jenkins entertaining a group of officers, gesturing animatedly. The sergeant avoided eye contact as Jamal placed the forms on the desk. "I need these processed immediately," Jamal stated firmly. "And I want the dash cam footage preserved." "Sorry, Captain," the sergeant replied, not sounding sorry at all. "The camera system was down for maintenance this morning. No footage available." Jamal's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. The message was clear. They were closing ranks around Jenkins. As he turned to leave, another burst of laughter followed him out. Instead of discouraging him, the blatant disrespect only strengthened his resolve. He fought discrimination in the courtroom for years. Now he would fight it from within the department itself. He pulled out his phone and dialed Maya's number. If the department wouldn't handle this properly, he'd find another way to address the systemic racism that plagued the force. The incident with Jenkins wasn't just about a damaged car. It was about power, respect, and the long overdue need for change in law enforcement. The evening light cast long shadows through the Thompson household as Jamal sat at the kitchen table with his wife Aisha. His suit jacket hung loosely on a chair, his tie loosened after the day's events. Aisha stood at the counter, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her principal's badge still pinned to her blouse. "They're testing you," Aisha said, her voice calm but concerned. "This isn't just about Jenkins or a damaged car. They want to see if you'll break." Jamal rubbed his temples, the headache from earlier still lingering. "I knew it wouldn't be easy when I accepted the captain's position, but this is deliberate provocation. Jenkins didn't just accidentally hit my car. He wanted to send a message. And what happens when the message becomes more than a damaged car?" Aisha moved to sit beside him, placing her hand over his. "You're not just fighting individual officers, Jamal. You're challenging an entire system." Their conversation was interrupted by the doorbell. Through the security camera feed on their phones, they saw Lieutenant Mark Jenkins standing on their porch, still in uniform. Jamal exchanged a glance with Aisha before heading to the door. Jenkins stood with his hands clasped in front of him, his posture less aggressive than earlier. "Captain Thompson, I wanted to apologize for the incident this morning. Things got out of hand." Jamal studied the lieutenant's face, noting the strain around his eyes. "Out of hand? You deliberately damaged my vehicle and then tried to blame me for it. That's not something getting out of hand, Lieutenant." "Look, I'm trying to make this right." Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. "The department can cover the repairs dash. This isn't about repairs," Jamal cut him off. "It's about respect, Lieutenant. It's about accountability. Do you understand what message you sent to every black officer in the department today? To every black citizen who witnessed that incident?" Jenkins's expression hardened. "I didn't come here to discuss politics, Captain. I made a professional courtesy call to apologize. Take it or leave it." "Professional courtesy?" Jamal's voice remained steady. "There was nothing professional about your actions today. And an apology without understanding is meaningless." As Jenkins left, his patrol car's tires squealing slightly on the asphalt, Aisha appeared beside Jamal in the doorway. "He didn't come to apologize," she observed. "He came to gauge your reaction." The next morning, Jamal faced another challenge during the department's weekly leadership meeting. Captain Ryan, a veteran officer with 20 years on the force, sat at the head of the conference table, his presence dominating the room. "Captain Thompson," Ryan's voice carried a hint of condescension. "Perhaps you'd like to explain yesterday's incident with Lieutenant Jenkins? Several officers have expressed concern about your handling of the situation." Jamal looked around the table, noting the mix of hostile and averted gazes. "I'd be happy to discuss the incident, Captain Ryan, including why the dashcam footage is mysteriously unavailable and why no official report was filed." "Are you suggesting impropriety, Thompson?" Ryan leaned forward. "Because that's a serious accuser, tying against fellow officers." "I'm suggesting transparency," Jamal replied firmly. "The same transparency I expect from every officer under my command." "Your command?" Ryan's laugh was sharp. "Let's be clear, Thompson. You may have the title, but you need to understand how things work here. Loyalty to the force comes first. Always. Loyalty to justice comes first," Jamal corrected. "And justice requires accountability." The tension in the room was palpable. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Ryan and Jamal locked eyes across the table. This wasn't just about yesterday's incident anymore. It was a clear challenge to Jamal's authority and his vision for the department. "Just remember, Thompson," Ryan said as the meeting concluded, "change is a slow process. Push too hard, too fast, and you might find yourself without the support you need when it really matters." As Jamal gathered his files, he noticed Officer Chun, a young Asian American officer, lingering behind. She approached cautiously, speaking in a low voice. "Captain Thompson, not everyone agrees with what happened yesterday. Some of us want things to change." She glanced nervously at the door. "But we need to know you'll be able to protect us if we stand with you." This interaction reinforced what Jamal already knew. The department was divided, and his next moves would be crucial. He had allies, but they were afraid to speak up. The question wasn't just about standing up to Jenkins and Ryan. It was about creating an environment where officers felt safe challenging the status quo. Maya Chen's newspaper office contrasted sharply with the sterile police precinct. Papers covered her desk, and sticky notes filled with leads decorated her dual monitors. As a veteran investigative journalist for the Milton Heights Tribune, she'd known Jamal since they were kids in the same neighborhood. Now, 20 years later, they sat across from each other, the weight of their current situation hanging between them. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore, Maya," Jamal said, sliding his phone across her desk. The screen showed photos of his damaged car. Jenkins did this in broad daylight, with witnesses. Maya studied the images, her expression grim. "This isn't just about Jenkins, is it? You've been captain for what, 3 months? And suddenly your car gets rammed by a known problematic officer?" "The timing isn't coincidental," Jamal agreed. "Ever since I started pushing for body cam reviews and accountability measures, there's been pushback. But this is different. It's escalating." Maya pulled up a folder on her computer. "I've been tracking complaints against officers in your precinct for the past 5 years. The pattern is clear. Excessive force complaints spike whenever reform measures are proposed. But here's what's interesting." She turned the monitor toward Jamal. "Most complaints involve the same group of officers, all working under Captain Ryan's direct supervision." The data on the screen showed a clear correlation. Jamal leaned forward, scanning the names. Many were familiar. Officers who'd been particularly resistant to his leadership. "I can help you expose this," Maya said, her voice determined. "But we need more than statistics. We need concrete evidence." Their investigation over the next few days revealed a disturbing pattern. Maya's sources within the department provided internal memos and email threads showing systematic suppression of civilian complaints. Body camera footage frequently went missing during controversial arrests, and officers with multiple complaints were routinely cleared by internal affairs. The breakthrough came when they discovered a series of text messages between Jenkins and other officers, discussing ways to undermine Jamal's authority. But the real shock was finding Captain Ryan's name repeatedly mentioned as the coordinator of these efforts. "Look at this." Maya pointed to a particular exchange. Ryan explicital. "Why instructed Jenkins to remind Thompson of his place." The car incident wasn't random. It was orchestrated. Before they could digest this information, Maya's police scanner crackled to life. Reports of a protest turning violent near downtown caught their attention. When they pulled up the live news feed, they saw officers in riot gear confronting peaceful protesters. In the middle of the chaos, a clear video showed Officer Phillips, one of Jenkins' closest allies, shoving an elderly black woman to the ground. The video went viral within hours. Social media exploded with calls for justice, and protests grew larger outside the precinct. Jamal's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters wanted statements. Community leaders demanded action, and the mayor's office was pressing for immediate resolution. "This is your moment," Maya said, already typing furiously at her keyboard. "The public needs to see the connection between this incident and the larger pattern of abuse." But Jamal knew the risks. "If we go public with everything now, they'll claim I'm exploiting this incident for personal vendetta. We need to be strategic." "They're already painting you as the enemy," Maya countered. "Yesterday's police union statement practically accused you of inciting the protests." The situation reached a boiling point when another video emerged, this one showing Jenkins and Phillips laughing about the incident in the precinct parking lot. The footage, captured by a rookie officer who'd had enough, was sent anonymously to Maya. Jamal stood at his office window, watching as protesters gathered outside the precinct. Signs demanding accountability and reform filled the air. Among the crowd, he spotted familiar faces, his clients, community members, even some fellow officers who'd finally found the courage to take a stand. His phone buzzed with a text from Aisha, "Be careful. Ryan just called an emergency department meeting for tomorrow." Maya looked up from her computer. "We have enough to run the story. But once we do this, there's no going back. You'll be directly challenging not just Jenkins, but the entire power structure of the department." Jamal watched as more protesters arrived, their chants echoing through the streets. The department he'd fought to join, the system he'd hoped to change from within, was now at a crossroads. His next move would either spark real change or end his career in law enforcement. "Do it," he said finally. "Run the story." It's time they understood that accountability isn't negotiable. As Maya began finalizing her article, neither of them noticed the unmarked police car parked across the street, its occupant carefully photographing everyone entering and leaving the newspaper office. The protests swelled outside the precinct, with hundreds of citizens filling the street. Signs reading "Black Lives Matter" and "Police Reform Now" dotted the crowd. Jamal stood at the top of the precinct steps, microphone in hand, facing a sea of angry faces. The department's press officer had advised against this direct confrontation, but Jamal knew silence wasn't an option anymore. "I hear your anger," he began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "I share your frustration, Then do something about it," someone shouted, triggering a wave of similar calls. "Where were you when they assaulted Mrs. Johnson?" another voice demanded, referring to the elderly woman from the viral video. The crowd's hostility was palpable. Jamal saw Maya in the press section, her camera rolling, capturing every moment. Next to her stood reporters from major networks, their presence indicating how this local conflict had captured national attention. "Officer Phillips has been suspended pending investigation," Jamal continued, fighting to be heard over the growing noise. But this isn't just about one incident or one officer. A chorus of boos drowned out his words. From the corner of his eye, he spotted Jenkins and Ryan watching from the precinct doorway, their expressions a mix of satisfaction and contempt. This was exactly what they wanted, to see him fail publicly, to prove he couldn't bridge the gap between the police and the community. After the failed speech, Jamal retreated to his office. Officer Chin knocked softly before entering. "Captain, I think I have an idea," she said, closing the door behind her. "What if we organize something different? Not a protest or a press conference, but a real conversation." Jamal looked up from his desk. "What are you suggesting?" "A community forum. Not in the precinct, but somewhere neutral. No uniforms, no press, just honest dialogue between officers and citizens. My church has a large community hall, and Pastor Williams has been wanting to help ease tensions." The idea took root quickly. Over the next few days, Jamal worked with Officer Chun and other sympathetic officers to organize the meeting. They reached out to community leaders, victims of police misconduct, and officers willing to participate in honest dialogue. Meanwhile, Mark Jenkins sat alone in his patrol car, parked outside his favorite diner. The past week's events played on repeat in his mind. He'd followed orders, done what Ryan asked, but something felt different now. The image of Mrs. Johnson hitting the ground kept surfacing in his thoughts, along with memories of his own grandmother. His radio crackled with a call about suspicious activity near the community center where Jamal's meeting was being planned. Ryan's voice came through, suggesting Jenkins check it out personally. The implication was clear: another opportunity to disrupt Thompson's efforts. Jenkins put his car in drive, but didn't immediately respond to the call. For the first time in his 15 years on the force, he questioned his role in maintaining what Ryan called the natural order. Back at the precinct, Jamal finalized the details for the community meeting. The response had been overwhelming. Over 200 people had registered to attend. Local businesses offered to provide food, and several respected community mediators volunteered to facilitate small group discussions. "You're making a mistake," Ryan warned, appearing in Jamal's doorway. "These people don't want dialogue. They want submission." "These people are the community we swore to protect and serve," Jamal countered. "And they deserve to be heard. You're choosing them over your own." Ryan's voice hardened. "That's not something we forget." As Ryan left, Officer Chin appeared with more concerning news. "Captain, someone's been spreading rumors that we're planning to use the meeting to identify and arrest protest organizers. Attendance numbers are dropping." Jamal leaned back in his chair, understanding the strategy at play. They couldn't stop the meeting directly, so they were poisoning it with fear and mistrust. It was time for a different approach. He picked up his phone and called Maya. "I need you to run a story, but not about corruption this time. I need you to help me tell a different story. About hope, about possibility, about what this department could be." That evening, as Jamal drove home, he noticed Jenkins's patrol car following him. Instead of heading home, he pulled into a small park, the same park where, as a teenager, he'd first been harassed by police officers for matching a description. He got out of his car and waited. Jenkins parked, but remained in his vehicle for several long moments before finally stepping out. The two men stood in the growing darkness, the weight of history, institutional power, and personal choice hanging between them. "We need to talk," Jamal said simply. Not as captain and lieutenant. Not as black and white. Just as two men who both took an oath to serve and protect. The Hamilton Community Center buzzed with nervous energy. Folding chairs arranged in concentric circles filled the main hall, creating an atmosphere of equality rather than confrontation. Jamal stood at the entrance, greeting each person who walked through the doors. He'd deliberately chosen to wear a suit rather than his uniform, setting the tone for the evening. Local business owners, teachers, activists, and off-duty officers filtered in. Among them, Jamal spotted Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman from the viral video, supported by her grandson. Her presence sent a ripple through the crowd. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Welcome, everyone," Jamal began, his voice carrying across the now-packed hall. "We're here tonight not to accuse or defend, but to listen and understand. Every person in this room has a story that deserves to be heard." The meeting started with small group discussions, each led by a trained facilitator. Stories emerged. A black teenager described being followed through stores by off-duty officers. A Hispanic business owner detailed weekly random inspections. A white officer admitted to witnessing misconduct, but staying silent out of fear. In one corner, Mark Jenkins sat quietly, listening to Mrs. Johnson speak. "I've lived in this city for 73 years, she said, her voice steady despite her recent ordeal. "I've seen changes, good and bad. But what happened to me? That wasn't about law and order. That was about power and fear." Meanwhile, across town at Roosevelt High School, where Aisha served as principal, tensions were reaching a breaking point. Students had organized a walkout in solidarity with the protests. Aisha watched from her office window as hundreds of teenagers gathered in the courtyard, many holding handmade signs. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jamal. "How are things there?" "Volatile," she replied. "The students are demanding action. They want the school to end its resource officer program." The school's resource officer, Sarah Martinez, knocked on Aisha's door. "Mrs. Thompson, the students are asking me to join them. They want to know where I stand." Aisha studied the young officer's face. "Where do you stand, Sarah?" "I became a cop to help people," Martinez replied, her voice wavering. "But lately I don't recognize the department I joined. What's happening at the community center tonight? That's what we should have been doing all along." Back at the community center, the discussions had intensified. A retired black officer spoke about the changes he'd witnessed over his 30-year career. "The problem isn't just individual officers," he explained. "It's a culture that rewards silence and punishes accountability." Mark Jenkins found himself increasingly uncomfortable, but not for the reasons he expected. The stories he heard weren't angry accusations, but painful truths that challenged his long-held beliefs. He watched as Captain Ryan, who had arrived late, stood in the back with a small group of officers, their disapproving expressions clear. The meeting reached a crucial moment when a young black man stood up to speak. "My brother was arrested last year," he said. The officers claimed he resisted, but the body cam footage disappeared. Lieutenant Jenkins was the arresting officer. All eyes turned to Jenkins. The silence in the room was deafening. He felt the weight of hundreds of gazes, some angry, some curious, some hopeful. For the first time in his career, he understood the true meaning of accountability. Slowly, Jenkins rose from his seat. Ryan's warning glare from across the room was impossible to miss, but something had shifted inside him. "You're right," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The footage didn't disappear. It was deleted, and I was the one who deleted it." The admission sent shockwaves through the room. Maya, who had been quietly observing from the corner, began writing furiously in her notebook. Jamal watched as officers and citizens alike processed this unexpected moment of honesty. "Why?" the young man asked simply. Jenkins looked around the room, his eyes finally meeting Jamal's. "Because that's what we were taught to do. Protect our own, no matter what. But sitting here tonight, listening to everyone, I realize we've been protecting the wrong things." As the meeting continued, Ryan and his supporters quietly left the hall. The message was clear. Jenkins's confession had crossed a line. The battle lines were being redrawn, not between police and community, but between those who sought change and those who resisted it. Later that night, as the center emptied, Jamal found Jenkins sitting alone in the parking lot. "You know there's no going back now," Jamal said. Jenkins nodded. "I've been thinking about something Mrs. Johnson said about power and fear. I always thought I had the power, but really, I was the one afraid. Afraid of change, afraid of losing control, afraid of admitting we were wrong." The community center's lights went dark, but the conversation started that night would continue to illuminate the path forward. Change had begun, not with protests or policies, but with the simple act of listening and speaking truth. The evidence sat heavily on Jamal's desk. Internal emails, redacted reports, and a USB drive containing deleted body cam footage that Jenkins had helped recover. Maya's investigation had uncovered a pattern stretching back years. Captain Ryan hadn't just protected corrupt officers. He'd cultivated them. "This goes deeper than we thought," Maya said, pointing to a spreadsheet on her laptop. "Ryan's been systematically promoting officers with excessive force complaints while pushing out those who report misconduct. Jenkins was just following an established playbook." Jamal studied a particularly damning email chain. Ryan had explicitly instructed supervisors to alter use of force reports, creating a false narrative about suspect resistance. The documentation was meticulous, likely kept as insurance against any potential whistleblowers. "He's too smart to meet this head-on," Jamal said. "We need to be careful about how we proceed." As if on cue, Ryan appeared in his doorway. "Got a minute, Thompson?" His casual tone belied the tension in his shoulders. Maya gathered her materials, nodding slightly to Jamal as she left. Ryan closed the door behind her, his expression hardening. "Jenkins has become a liability," Ryan said without preamble. "Your little community meeting was quite the show, very inspiring. But now you've got officers questioning procedures, demanding reviews of old cases. This stops now." Jamal remained seated, maintaining eye contact. "The only thing stopping is the cover-up, Ryan. We have everything, the altered reports, the deleted footage, the promotional patterns. You have allegations and circumstantial evidence," Ryan countered. But there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "And even if you did have more, think about what this would do to the department. To morale. To public trust. Public trust." Jamal stood slowly. "You've been systematically destroying public trust for years. Every false report, every covered-up incident, every good officer you've pushed out. That's what destroys trust." Ryan moved closer, his voice dropping. "Let me be clear. Your position as captain was a political appointment. Political appointments can be reversed. And accidents happen, Thompson, even to captains." The threat hung in the air between them. Jamal had expected this moment, but the reality of it still sent a chill through him. "That sounded like a threat, Captain Ryan. Would you like to clarify that statement for the record?" Ryan's eyes darted to Jamal's desk, where a small red light blinked on his phone. The conversation was being recorded. "You're playing a dangerous game," Ryan snarled, backing toward the door. "Ask yourself if it's worth it. Ask your wife if it's worth it." After Ryan left, Jamal called Aisha at her school. The mention of his wife had crossed a line he couldn't ignore. "They're desperate," Aisha said after hearing about the confrontation. "Ryan knows Jenkins's confession opened the floodgates. More officers will come forward. Maybe you should stay with your sister for a while," Jamal suggested, the worry evident in his voice. "No." Aisha's response was immediate. "We knew this could get ugly when you took the position. I'm not going anywhere. But Jamal, maybe you should consider stepping down. We could move, start fresh somewhere else." The suggestion hung between them. It would be easier to walk away, to let someone else fight this battle. But the faces from the community meeting flashed through his mind. Mrs. Johnson, the young man whose brother was wrongly arrested, the officers who wanted change but needed leadership. "I can't," he said finally. "If I step down now, Ryan wins. The system stays broken. Nothing changes." "I knew you'd say that," Aisha replied, pride mixing with concern in her voice. "Just promise me you'll be careful. Ryan's the type who'd rather burn everything down than lose control." That evening, as Jamal worked late in his office, Officer Chin knocked urgently on his door. "Captain, you need to see this." She handed him her phone, displaying an internal memo. Ryan had called for a department-wide review of all recent arrests and investigations, specifically targeting cases handled by officers who attended the community meeting. "He's sending a message," Chen said. "Several officers are already talking about transferring out." Jamal read the memo again, understanding the strategy. Ryan was using bureaucratic pressure to isolate him, to show other officers the cost of standing up for change. But he'd made a crucial mistake. The memo itself was evidence of retaliation. "Get me Jenkins," Jamal said. "It's time to move this from internal affairs to the district attorney's office." As Chun left to make the call, Jamal stared at the photos on his office wall. His graduation from the police academy, his swearing in as captain, the recent community meeting. Each image represented a step in his journey, leading to this moment. Ryan had made his move. Now it was time for Jamal to make his. Maya's exposé dominated the front page of the Milton Heights Tribune. Systemic corruption exposed. Police leadership accused of cover UPS and retaliation. The accompanying online version included audio clips, redacted documents, and a damning timeline of events. Within hours, national news outlets picked up the story. The article was methodically structured, beginning with Jenkins's car incident and building toward the larger pattern of corruption. Maya had included testimony from multiple officers, including Jenkins himself, describing Ryan's systematic approach to silencing whistleblowers and protecting abusive officers. Internal documents reveal a decades-long pattern of misconduct, the article read. Captain Ryan, along with senior leadership, maintained what officers privately called a shadow discipline system, rewarding those who maintained a code of silence while forcing out officers who reported violations. Jamal watched from his office as news vans gathered outside the precinct. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since the story broke at 6 a.m. The mayor's office, the FBI, civil rights organizations, and countless reporters all wanted statements. "Officer," Chen appeared in his doorway. "Captain, Internal Affairs is here. And there's something else you should see." She handed him her phone. A video was circulating among officers, showing Mark Jenkins being confronted in the precinct parking lot. Ryan and 3 other officers surrounded him, their body language threatening. "You ungrateful piece of shit," Ryan's voice was clear in the recording. "After everything I did for you, you run to Thompson? You think you can just throw away 15 years of loyalty?" Jenkins stood his ground. Loyalty to what? Ryan? To beating innocent people? To destroying evidence? "I'm done. We should all be done." The video ended with Ryan shoving Jenkins against a car. "You're done all right. Watch your back, Mark. Rats don't last long in this city." Jamal immediately called Maya. "We need to add the parking lot footage to your story. This isn't just about past corruption anymore, it's active intimidation." "Already on it," Maya replied. "But Jamal, be careful. My sources say Ryan's called in every favor he has. Police union representatives are flying in from the state capitol. They're going to try to paint this as an attack on law enforcement itself." Throughout the day, reactions poured in. The mayor called an emergency press conference, promising a thorough investigation. Civil rights attorneys filed class action lawsuits on behalf of victims of police misconduct. Social media exploded with both support for the whistleblowers and angry defenses of the department. Mark Jenkins sat in Jamal's office, looking exhausted. "They're following me," he said. "Unmarked cars outside my house. My wife's getting hang-up calls. Ryan's people want to make an example of me." "We anticipated this," Jamal replied, sliding a business card across the desk. "This attorney specializes in whistleblower protection. She's expecting your call." Just then Aisha called. "Turn on the news," she said urgently. The local station was broadcasting live from police union headquarters. Ryan stood at a podium, surrounded by supportive officers and union officials. "Captain Thompson and his allies have orchestrated a calculated attack on this department," Ryan declared. "They've taken isolated incidents, twisted them out of context, and created a false narrative of corruption. Their real agenda is to undermine law enforcement and compromise public safety." He continued, his voice rising with practiced indignation. "Mark Jenkins, once a decorated officer, has been manipulated into betraying his oath. These so-called revelations are nothing more than the bitter accusations of a troubled officer seeking revenge for disciplinary actions. Jamal watched as Ryan masterfully spun the narrative, presenting himself as a defender of traditional policing against radical reformers. He knew this playbook: discredit the whistleblowers, rally the rank and file, and paint any criticism as an attack on law enforcement itself. But something was different this time. As Ryan spoke, the camera panned across the assembled officers. Many looked uncomfortable. Some even stepped away from the podium. The old tactics weren't working as well anymore. Maya called again. Social media is blowing up with officers' wives sharing stories. They're tired of the culture of silence, tired of watching their spouses struggle with what they've seen and done. Ryan didn't count on the family speaking out. The pressure continued to mount throughout the day. More officers came forward, each new testimony adding weight to the investigation. The district attorney's office announced the formation of a special task force to review cases involving Ryan and his allies. By evening, Jamal received word that FBI agents were serving search warrants at multiple locations, including Ryan's home and office. The wall of silence was crumbling. As he prepared to leave for the day, Jamal found a note on his windshield. "You've started a war you can't win. Everything burns." The threat was expected, almost cliché, but it carried a weight of desperation. Ryan and his supporters weren't just fighting to maintain power anymore. They were fighting for survival. Maya added one final update to her story that night. Sources confirmed that federal investigators have obtained encrypted communications between Captain Ryan and several high-ranking city officials, suggesting the corruption extends beyond the police department itself. This story continues to develop. The Emergency Police Commission meeting turned chaotic within minutes. The conference room, packed with officers, union representatives, and department officials, crackled with tension. Ryan sat at one end of the long table, his usual confidence replaced by barely contained fury. His attorney, a sharp-suited woman from the police union's legal team, whispered constantly in his ear. "These allegations are not only false but dangerous," Ryan's attorney declared, standing to address the commission. Captain Ryan's distinguished 20-year career speaks for itself. This witch hunt, orchestrated by Captain Thompson and his media allies, has already damaged department morale and public safety. Before she could continue, Jenkins stepped forward, dropping a thick folder on the table. "Everything's here," he said, his voice steady despite the hostile stares from Ryan's supporters. "Dates, times, locations. Every falsified report, every covered-up complaint, every officer who was forced out for speaking up." Ryan lunged across the table. "You treacherous dash!" Two commissioners moved quickly to restrain him, but the damage was done. Phone cameras captured his loss of control, and within minutes, the footage was spreading across social media. Outside the police headquarters, the largest protest yet had gathered. Unlike previous demonstrations, this one included a striking mix of participants. Black Lives Matter activists stood alongside police families. Reform advocates shared space with veteran officers who'd been pushed out for reporting misconduct. Signs reading "Support Good Cops" mingled with "End Police Corruption." Mrs. Johnson, now a powerful symbol of the movement, addressed the crowd from a makeshift stage. "This isn't about attacking the police," she declared, her voice carrying surprising strength. "This is about saving the police from those who've corrupted it. We need law enforcement, but we need it to serve and protect everyone equally." Jamal watched from the steps as the crowd responded to her words. The narrative was shifting. This wasn't just another protest against police brutality. It was becoming a unified demand for institutional change. Officer Chen appeared at his side. "Captain, you need to see this." She showed him her phone, displaying internal message boards where officers from precincts across the city were sharing their own stories of coercion and cover-ups under Ryan's leadership. The momentum built throughout the day. More officers came forward, each new testimony adding weight to Jenkins's evidence. The mayor's office, initially hesitant to take sides, issued a statement supporting a full federal investigation. Ryan made one last attempt to rally support, calling an impromptu press conference in the precinct parking lot. But as he approached the microphone, something unprecedented happened. Officers began turning their backs, first a few, then dozens. The gesture, traditionally used to show disrespect for cop killers and corrupt officers, carried unmistakable symbolism. "You're throwing away everything we built," Ryan shouted at their backs. "Thompson doesn't understand what it takes to maintain order in this city. None of you do." His words echoed across the nearly empty parking lot, most media having already left to cover the larger protest. The few remaining cameras captured his increasing desperation as he realized his support had evaporated. Inside the precinct, Jamal met with a group of senior officers who'd previously aligned with Ryan. "We're ready to talk," their spokesperson said. "There are things you need to know about operations beyond the department." As they shared details of a broader corruption network involving city officials, business leaders, and even judges, Jamal understood why Ryan had fought so hard to maintain control. The department hadn't just been covering up individual incidents. It had been protecting an entire system of influence and power. The protest continued into the evening, illuminated by news cameras and cell phone lights. Families brought children, local businesses provided food and water, and off-duty officers in civilian clothes joined the crowd. The atmosphere was more determined than angry, more hopeful than hostile. Maya found Jamal W. etching the scene from his office window. "It's not just a local story anymore," she said. "National papers are calling this a turning point in police reform. Other departments across the country are facing similar reckonings." Ryan didn't understand, Jamal replied. He thought he was fighting to protect the department, but he was really fighting to protect a system that was destroying it from within. As night fell, the protesters began an impromptu candlelight vigil. The lights spread through the crowd, creating a powerful image of unity and purpose. Among the faces illuminated by candlelight, Jamal spotted Jenkins standing with his family, Officer Chun with a group of young officers, and Mrs. Johnson surrounded by supporters from both the community and the department. The old walls were crumbling, but something new was being built in their place. The question now was whether they could maintain this momentum and transform it into lasting change. The unmarked envelope arrived at Jamal's home address at 3 a.m., slipped under his front door. Inside was a single photograph. Aisha leaving her school, timestamped from yesterday. On the back, written in block letters, "How much are you willing to lose for your crusade?" Jamal studied the photo under his kitchen light, his hands steady despite the rage building inside him. Aisha stood behind him, her presence calm but resolute. "They're desperate," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "This proves we're winning." "This proves they're dangerous," Jamal countered. "I can handle threats to myself, but this..." He gestured at the photo. "This crosses every line." Before they could discuss it further, Jamal's phone buzzed with an urgent text from Maya. "Ryan's been called to testify before federal investigators tomorrow. Sources say he's ready to talk. Meeting in 20. The pre-dawn streets were empty as Jamal drove to their usual meeting spot, a 24-hour diner on the edge of town. Maya was already there, laptop open, coffee untouched. Ryan's attorney reached out to the FBI, she explained as Jamal sat down. "He's offering names, dates, everything. But he wants immunity." "Immunity?" Jamal's voice was sharp. "After everything he's done? It's bigger than we thought." Maya lowered her voice. "The corruption doesn't stop at the department. Ryan's got evidence linking 3 city council members, 2 judges, and several prominent business leaders to a years-long conspiracy. Protection money, contract fixing, evidence tampering, it's all connected." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mark Jenkins, looking haggard and nervous. He slid into the booth next to Maya. "They came to my house last night," he said without preamble. "Ryan's people said they'd make everything go away if I recanted my testimony. Said they'd even arrange a promotion to detective." And Jamal studied his former adversary's face. "And I told them to go to hell," Jenkins replied. "But Captain..." "Jamal, they mentioned things about my daughter's college schedule. They're watching our families." The threat hung heavy in the pre-dawn air. Outside the diner's windows, the city was beginning to wake up, unaware of the power struggle unfolding in its shadows. "I need to tell you something else," Jenkins continued, his voice dropping even lower. "Ryan's not just testifying to save himself. He's planning something, I overheard his supporters talking about contingency plans if the testimony doesn't go their way. They mentioned something about old files and insurance policies. Maya was already typing. What kind of files? I don't know exactly, but they seemed confident it would destroy multiple careers. Not just in the department, but in City Hall, the courthouse. Jenkins paused, looking directly at Jamal. And they specifically mentioned having something on you. Jamal leaned back, his mind racing. From before I joined the force? Jenkins nodded. They've been digging into everyone's past. Anything that could be twisted, taken out of context. Let them try, Jamal said firmly. Everything I've done, every case I've handled, every decision I've made, it's all been about justice. I'm not afraid of my past. But as he spoke, a memory surfaced. A case from his early days as a lawyer. A compromise he'd made to protect a client. Nothing illegal, but in the wrong light. His phone buzzed again, a message from Officer Chin. Emergency meeting called for 9 a.m. Ryan wants to address the entire department. Maya was already gathering her things. This is it. He's either going to confess everything or try to burn it all down. He'll burn it down, Jenkins said quietly. That's who he is. Who I used to be. When you're so convinced you're right, collateral damage doesn't matter. The sun was rising as they left the diner, casting long shadows across the empty parking lot. Jamal noticed a car with tinted windows parked across the street, its engine running. We're being watched, he noted calmly. We've been watched since this started, Jenkins replied. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Maya touched Jamal's arm. Whatever Ryan's planning, we need to get ahead of it. Let me publish what we know about the threats, the surveillance. Once it's public, no, Jamal interrupted. That's what he expects. He wants us to look paranoid, desperate. We need to be smarter. He pulled out his phone and dialed Aisha's number. Honey, remember that conversation we had about truth and consequences? It's time. Her response was immediate. I'll get the files from the safe. Are you sure? Yes, Jamal said, watching the sun rise over his troubled city. If Ryan wants to play with fire, he needs to understand some of us have been fireproof for a long time. The morning traffic was beginning to build as they drove back to the precinct. In a few hours, Ryan would make his play, but for the first time since this started, Jamal felt truly prepared. Sometimes, the only way to fight fire was with fire of your own. The precinct's main conference room had never felt smaller. Officers packed the space, tension visible in every face. News cameras lined the back wall. Ryan had insisted on making this public. Jamal sat in the front row, Aisha's files secure in his briefcase, while Maya positioned herself near the door, her recorder running. Ryan approached the podium, his police uniform pristine, his expression grave. The room fell silent. For 20 years, I've served this department, he began, his voice carrying the weight of practiced authority. I've made decisions, difficult decisions, to protect our officers and maintain order in this city. He paused, scanning the room. His gaze lingered on Jenkins, who sat straight-backed beside Jamal. But recent events have forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths. Lieutenant Jenkins's testimony has raised serious concerns about departmental procedures. And while I maintain that my actions were always in service of this department, I acknowledge that mistakes were made. The room stirred. This wasn't the defiant Ryan they'd expected. Jamal felt the shift in the air. Something was coming. However, Ryan continued, his tone hardening, before we embrace Captain Thompson's vision of reform, this department deserves to know the truth about their new leader. He gestured, and an officer began distributing folders to the assembled crowd. Jamal recognized them, copies of old case files, newspaper clippings, surveillance photos. 7 years ago, before joining our ranks, Captain Thompson defended a man named Marcus Williams. Williams was accused of drug trafficking, but the charges were mysteriously dropped. What this department doesn't know is that key evidence disappeared from the prosecutor's office. The room erupted in whispers. Ryan pressed on, his voice rising. We have evidence suggesting Thompson arranged for that evidence to vanish, trading on old connections to protect High's client. A client who, coincidentally, made several large donations to various community organizations Thompson was involved with. Jamal stood slowly, buttoning his jacket. Are you finished, Captain Ryan? Not nearly, Ryan sneered. We also have documentation of Dash. Actually, you are finished, Jamal interrupted, his voice calm but carrying. He opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. Maya, would you please distribute these? As Maya moved through the room, handing out documents, Jamal addressed the crowd. The Marcus Williams case wasn't about drug trafficking. He was an undercover FBI informant, working to expose corruption in the prosecutor's office. The evidence didn't disappear. It was secured as part of a federal investigation. An investigation that led to the conviction of 3 corrupt prosecutors. He turned to face Ryan directly. An investigation that also uncovered a network of police officers who were taking payoffs to plant evidence and falsify reports. Officers who reported directly to a young sergeant named David Ryan. The color drained from Ryan's face. The evidence wasn't released publicly to protect ongoing operations, Jamal continued. Marcus Williams died 2 years later, killed by the same criminal organization he helped expose. I kept these files sealed out of respect for his sacrifice. But you forced this, Ryan. You forced all of it. Jenkins stood up next. There's more, he announced, his voice steady. I've been recording every conversation, every meeting, every threat since the car incident, including last night's visit to my home. The room erupted again, but this time the whispers carried a different tone. Officers began flipping through the documents Maya had distributed, their expressions shifting from suspicion to shock. Ryan lunged for the podium, but his movements were desperate now. You can't prove Dash. Federal agents are already moving on the locations you identified in your immunity deal. Jamal cut him off. The judges, the council members, everyone. But you never planned to testify, did you? This was your last attempt to save yourself by destroying others. As if on cue, FBI agents appeared at the conference room doors. The lead agent stepped forward. Captain David Ryan, you're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and witness intimidation. You have the right to remain silent. As Ryan was led away in handcuffs, the room remained stunned. Jamal moved to the podium, surveying the faces before him. Officers young and old, black and white, those who'd supported him and those who doubted. This department isn't about any one person or group, he said quietly. It's about the oath we all took, to protect and serve. All of us, all of them. It's time we started living up to that promise. Outside, the morning sun had burned away the last shadows. News helicopters circled overhead as Ryan was led to a waiting federal vehicle. Maya was already on her phone, updating her story. Jenkins stood with a group of officers, explaining his role in the investigation. Aisha appeared at Jamal's side. You did it, she said simply. We did it, he corrected her. All of us. But this is just the beginning. As if to emphasize his point, Mrs. Johnson emerged from the crowd gathering outside, leading a group of community members. They carried signs, but not of protest. These read, "Support our reform," and "Community and Police United." The wall between police and community hadn't just been breached. It had been transformed into a bridge. There would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight, but for now, in this moment, change wasn't just possible. It was inevitable. And in the end, that's what justice looked like. Not a single victory, but a continuous commitment to doing what's right, one day at a time, one choice at a time, until the extraordinary becomes ordinary and equality becomes the only acceptable standard.